Hello guys, I'm Tom, and today we're going to explore what Project Terror is all about. In the vast and disturbing world of contemporary horror and science fiction cinema, few fictional threats have managed to leave such a deep and visceral scar as the deadly virus known as DC2, also referred to by the unsettling name Project Terror. This biological creation, conceived as a weapon of destruction, is not merely another plot device in Planet Terror. It serves as the ultimate catalyst of a catastrophe that oscillates between the grotesque, the absurd, and the apocalyptic. The film, directed with a unique blend of irreverence and brilliance by Robert Rodriguez, and produced by the infallible Quentin Tarantino, becomes a violent cocktail of body horror, explosive action, and dark comedy in true Grindhouse fashion, immersing the viewer in an experience as shocking as it is unforgettable. What makes DC2 such a chilling phenomenon is not only its devastating destructive power, but also its deeply unstable and mutagenic nature. This virus was meticulously engineered to corrupt and transform human biology, turning its victims into aberrations of flesh and rage known as the Sickos. These entities are a grotesque blend of zombies and monsters, but with a far darker and more sinister background, the result of uncontrolled scientific experiments and unrestrained military ambition. However, to fully grasp the magnitude of its impact, we must delve into the shadows of its origin, a web of conspiracies, forbidden science, and power plays, revealed both in the main narrative and in the complementary lore surrounding the film. The true genesis of the virus remains hidden beneath a dense veil of ambiguity, but fragments of dialogue and scattered clues suggest its roots lie in a remote and conflict-ridden enclave in the Middle East. According to the testimony of Lieutenant Muldoon, a character whose past is as tainted as the world he inhabits, he and his squad were exposed to the virus during a covert operation in that hostile region. All indications point to the creation of DC2 being the work of local scientists, collaborating with a brilliant, yet morally questionable bioengineer named Abby. Their goal? To manufacture a next-generation biological weapon, an invisible, lethal tool to be sold to the highest bidder in the dark marketplace of modern warfare. From the outset of the story, it is implied that Abby delivered a sample of the virus to Muldoon under orders from the US government, which was interested in evaluating DC2's potential as a weapon of mass destruction. But what's most chilling is that, for the already contaminated soldiers, the virus became a kind of temporary and cruel salvation. As long as they inhaled its gaseous form, they could remain alive, though at the cost of a slow and monstrous transformation that stripped them entirely of their humanity. Everything collapses when Muldoon, blinded by greed and a thirst for absolute power, attempts to seize the remaining virus for personal or military use. During a clandestine deal, upon discovering that Abby possesses more of the virus than she admitted, he decides to capture her in order to fully control the fate of this biological weapon. However, anticipating the betrayal, Abby sabotages the exchange by shooting a container that releases the virus in its gaseous form, triggering an unstoppable chain reaction. The toxic cloud spreads quickly through the atmosphere, reaching a nearby small town where the real tragedy begins. Within hours, chaos erupts. The townspeople transform into sickos, ravenous and deranged creatures driven by an uncontrollable hunger and violence. Their erratic, animalistic behavior, devoid of any humanity, is reminiscent of the infected in the crazies from the Trixie virus, but DC2 adds a level of brutality and disfigurement never seen before. As the infection spreads, the story turns into a desperate struggle for survival against a force that has eluded every effort at containment. The catastrophe escalates dramatically when an underground military facility, where vast quantities of DC2 were stored, suffers a devastating explosion. The pathogen, now unleashed into the groundwater and soil, begins to spread beyond the infected town, contaminating rivers, water reservoirs, and agricultural zones. The infection advances rapidly, reaching rural, urban, and even larger populated areas. What initially seemed like a local crisis becomes a global pandemic, and the world as we knew it begins to collapse under the weight of this unstoppable biological threat. In the final stages of the film, we find Cherry Darling, an unexpected and courageous heroine, taking refuge with a diverse group of survivors on a remote beach in Mexican territory. There, amid the ruins of a civilization that seems extinct, they try to rebuild a fragile new beginning, a sanctuary in a world now overrun by monsters that were once human, victims of an experiment that spiraled out of control. With this devastating backdrop established, it's time to analyze in detail the most terrifying characteristics of DC2, its method of transmission, the physiological effects it triggers, the grotesque deformities it spawns, and the scarce and desperate chances of halting its spread. DC2 is an extremely infectious virus, and its most dangerous form is airborne. Merely inhaling a small amount of the contaminated gas is enough to activate the transformation process. Within minutes, the first symptoms begin to manifest at an alarmingly fast rate. Severe neurological alterations, rapid tissue decomposition, and a total loss of individual identity. The infected, now sickos, develop a ravenous, aggressive behavior completely devoid of consciousness, relentlessly biting and infecting anyone in their path, accelerating the spread in a brutal and exponential manner. There is, however, a faint and narrow chance of salvation. If someone is bitten, they can be saved only if they manage to amputate the infected limb before the virus reaches the central bloodstream. This is an extreme, painful, and desperate measure, but in this biological hell, losing a hand, arm, or leg is a small price to pay for retaining life and sanity. Interestingly, the virus is not transmitted simply through contact with blood or bodily fluids. Some characters have traces of infectious fluids on their skin without experiencing immediate effects, indicating that the pathogen requires direct entry into the respiratory or circulatory system to trigger its horrifying metamorphosis. This detail adds another layer of mystery and terror to DC2's nature, leaving open the possibility of future mutations and resistances. Once inside the body, DC2 attacks the brain with terrifying surgical precision. Its primary target is the frontal lobe, erasing all capacity for judgment, memory, empathy, and rational control. The only remaining functions are the basic bodily ones necessary for survival, allowing the infected creature to persist as a hungry, primitive, and destructive shell. The insatiable need to consume human flesh is not a side effect, but a deliberate and macabre design of the virus. This devouring impulse was part of the creator's original plan, to transform the civilian population into an uncontrollable internal threat, thus paving the way for military invasions and wars with no organized resistance or humanity left to protect. Physically, the sickos undergo grotesque and progressive deterioration. Their skin quickly becomes covered in blisters, open wounds, bleeding pustules, and unhealing burns. Their faces become deformed beyond recognition, their tongues swell, and their bodies become more misshapen with each passing hour under the virus's influence. Eventually, their skin begins to peel away like a cadaverous mask, revealing bare muscle, tendons, and bone in a macabre spectacle straight out of the deepest nightmares. This transformation is especially alarming in Muldoon and his men, exposed for far too long and forced to inhale the gas form of the virus to remain functional. They become entirely dependent on that continuous exposure to avoid full degeneration. When the source is cut off, their bodies rapidly decay into tumorous, degenerate masses, almost mythological figures that embody biological horror in its purest form. Though the sickos move slowly, erratically, and often clumsily, their physical strength is overwhelming. They require no weapons or tools, Their sharpened teeth, deformed hands, and animalistic brutality are enough to tear through human bodies with terrifying ferocity. Every encounter with one of these creatures is a deadly dance of chaos, desperation, and survival. When we talk about those infected by the DC2 virus, the feared and merciless Sickos, there is one trait that sets them drastically apart from any other threat in contemporary horror cinema: their brutal and almost ritualistic way of feeding. They don't simply hunt or attack for survival. These creatures devour with a ferocity that feels torn from a collective nightmare, an unrestrained hunger that rips through human flesh with staggering speed and precision, reminiscent of a frenzied school of piranhas mercilessly overwhelming their prey. This instinctive, visceral, and uncontrollable violence is not only part of the visual spectacle and narrative tension, it also serves as a raw, poetic symbol of civilization's total collapse, a grim reminder of what happens when the body rebels against the soul and reason is devoured by the most primal instinct. And if the ravenous brutality of these creatures is already terrifying, what truly sends shivers down the spine is how easily the DC2 virus spreads. This pathogen does not require direct physical contact to propagate. It moves through the air, invisible, silent, and lethal. It slips in with every breath, every unsuspecting inhale, every accidental exchange of oxygen in a closed or open space. Merely being inside or near a contaminated area, whether it's the military base where the disaster originated, the affected town, or even the connecting roads between those locations, is enough to risk exposure. The threat becomes an invisible, imminent, and nearly unavoidable danger. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, adding depth and mystery to the narrative. Despite the virus's seemingly unstoppable and flawless transmission, not everyone within the danger zone ends up infected or succumbing to DC2. A small group, isolated, enigmatic, and almost mythological, appears to possess natural immunity. These individuals aren't injected, don't wear protective gear, and take no special precautions. Yet, they survive the contamination that devastates everyone else. The film deliberately leaves this detail open to interpretation, fueling theories and debates. Is it due to a rare genetic mutation, a natural and acquired biological defense, or simply a narrative device meant to spark hope and suspense? What's clear is that this immunity has been the subject of intense and passionate discussions among fans of the film, who still debate whether these immune individuals might be vulnerable to other forms of direct infection, such as a sicko bite or prolonged exposure to the virus's airborne form. The movie provides no definitive answers, but offers enough clues and ambiguities to keep speculation alive. In addition to this intriguing biological phenomenon, there's another element that adds a further layer of complexity and desperation: the experimental treatment introduced during the film. The enigmatic and brilliant scientist Abby reveals that the only way to temporarily halt the virus's aggressive evolution is, paradoxically, to introduce small controlled doses of the virus into the body. A move as desperate as it is ingeniously brilliant, turning the infection into a double-edged weapon. This micro-infection, administered with precision, appears to fool the virus, keeping it in check for a few hours, slowing cellular destruction and the progression of metamorphosis. While far from being a cure or definitive solution, this improvised intervention becomes a kind of biological truce, a brief reprieve for those already condemned to a slow and painful transformation. Sadly, this fragile and hopeful breakthrough is tragically lost with Abby's death. His murder not only represents a heartbreaking and emotional moment on a human level, but also symbolizes the loss of the only mind capable of understanding, manipulating, and perhaps reversing the effects of DC2. With his death, all valuable knowledge is lost, condemning the world to face an infectious agent that's entirely out of control, with no countermeasures and the ominous ability to mutate. Because yes, DC2 is an unstable, evolving virus, a living entity in constant change. Without scientific intervention, its progression could lead to even deadlier and more terrifying variants, perhaps with new methods of transmission, not just through the air, but also through water, bodily fluids, or even direct skin contact. But what truly sets DC2 apart from other fictional viruses in horror cinema is the peculiar progression of its initial infection. Unlike classic zombies, who lose their humanity immediately after being infected, those infected by DC2 do not succumb to madness instantly. During the early stages, which can last minutes or even hours, the individual retains partial consciousness, the ability to reason, communicate, and even plan. However, all of this is tainted and perverted by a lethal biological impulse: the compulsive desire to spread the disease, to turn others into what they are becoming. The most revealing case of this disturbing duality is that of Dr. Block. Apparently aware of his condition and the monstrosity he faces, he chooses to use his fading lucidity for a specific and chilling purpose: to find his wife Dakota with the deliberate intention of infecting her. He doesn't act erratically or at random. He pursues her, watches her, stalks her with calculated intentions, blending love and destruction into a single act of desperation and terror. In one of the hospital's most shocking scenes, another infected person, still retaining some level of awareness, uses a tool to attack Block and ends up infecting him through direct contact with his own open skin wounds, proving that the infection can also be transmitted through exposed injuries and violent acts. And if this ability to retain some semblance of lucidity and strategic behavior is already disturbing, what follows crosses the line into a new level of horror altogether. The Sickos are capable of speech. They don't just growl or emit guttural, animalistic sounds. They talk to the uninfected, using words, phrases, and expressions that carry deeply disturbing psychological weight. This linguistic capacity adds a completely new and unsettling dimension that very few films in the subgenre dare to explore. What happens when the monster doesn't lose the ability to speak? What happens when that creature still knows who you are and still hunts you down with the intent to kill or infect you? It's a level of horror that strikes at the mind and the soul, turning every encounter into a nightmare with a human face.